SpaceX is inching ever closer towards Starship's 7th flight, with both Booster 14 and Ship 33 going through engine testing this week. We've also seen lots of work on future vehicles at the production site, a lot of work at the launch site as usual, and SpaceX has hit the Black Friday jackpot at the tank farm shop. They've bought not one, not two, but 6 new tanks. As always, there'll be all of that and much more in this Starbase update, sponsored by Novium. As is usual, before every Starship flight, each vehicle needs to be tested separately, and there's been plenty of that going on this week. Let's start with Booster 14, the Super Heavy booster set to fly on Starship's 7th mission. This is precisely where we left off in our previous Starbase update, where we discussed the rare spin prime test of Booster 14. During that test, we observed a propellant load similar to what you'd expect in a static fire test. However, instead of a static fire, at the end of the load, there was a spin prime test instead. With that test successfully completed, SpaceX prepared for a static fire on December 9th. The test appeared to proceed smoothly, with the tank farm activating early and the propellant loading sequence running cleanly. As a result, we were treated to a morning static fire of Booster 14 lasting roughly 10 seconds, which is always an exciting sight. We were also treated to this stunning footage from SpaceX of the test, featuring for the first time a camera view from the launch mount looking up at the booster's engines in action. This is a nice change from the previous test campaign where SpaceX didn't seem to mention Booster 13's static fire at all. With the static fire test successfully completed, Booster 14 had no further testing to undergo at the launch site, so SpaceX promptly returned it to Mega Bay 1 for pre-flight preparations. The teams will likely carry out final inspections, apply necessary upgrades, and address any required fixes before rolling it back to the launch site, but next time for launch. During that flight, we'll see Ship 33 atop Booster 14, and we've also seen some testing on that ship this week. We'd anticipated this test, as last week SpaceX had moved the engine testing stand to the production site. It was just a matter of rolling it into Mega Bay 2 and positioning Ship 33 on top. That's precisely what occurred on December 11th, with Ship 33 being rolled to the Massey's outpost for engine testing. As we've mentioned before, Ship 33 is the first of the second version of the ship, featuring numerous upgrades from the tanks to the heat shield and even the forward flaps. One thing that remains relatively similar is the engines, which are still Raptor 2 engines. The reason I say relatively is, well, this is SpaceX we're talking about. There's a very, very high chance that the Raptor 2s we're seeing flying now are quite different from the Raptor 2s that flew on Booster 7 and Ship 24 during Starship's first flight. But even if the engines happen to be exactly the same down to every bolt, the ship's modifications also include changes to the transfer lines and the manifolds inside the tanks that feed the engines. That reason alone would be more than enough to warrant thorough testing of those engines with this new version of the ship. And to the surprise of absolutely nobody, SpaceX conducted a spin prime test of Ship 33's engines on December 12th, just as we all anticipated. And, we expected this because this is typically the type of engine testing SpaceX performs prior to a full static fire test, which is exactly what we've just seen with Booster 14. Ship 33 went into testing again 2 days later on December 14th, but there were no signs of a static fire and the weather was so dreadful that we didn't even see any indications of a spin prime. It could have been another spin prime, but we've not been able to tell. It could also have been an aborted test before any engine testing actually occurred, or perhaps SpaceX simply just wanted to test loading propellants onto the ship. As usual, it's difficult to say for certain without official information. SpaceX doesn't send out a press release every day telling us what they're doing that day at Starbase. We just have to guess this stuff based off our views. Obviously, the end of the engine testing campaign, at least so far, is the static fire test, and so we were hoping to see that happen at some point. Lo and behold, just this Sunday, we got that from Ship 33 under arguably better weather conditions than the day before. Shana Diaz, SpaceX's director of Starship engineering, celebrated the test on X, citing the progress made on the way to Flight 7. So, with Booster 14 back in Mega Bay 1 and Ship 33's engine test campaign potentially complete, all eyes are on 2 key things. But first,
hey, it's the holidays, and if you're anything like me, then you sometimes struggle to find a perfect gift for someone that you care about. Well, this video's sponsor, Novium, makes pens that magnetically float. They're called hover pens, and they're inspired by space and a perfect gift for any space fan in your life. Weightlessness is one of the coolest things about spaceflight, so of course I love these pens. The Interstellar edition has a tilt of 23.5 degrees, reminiscent of the Earth's axis of rotation. It comes in super cool colors like Neptune Blue, Starlight Silver, and Mars Magma. Plus, there is a premium version with 18 karat gold and even a real meteorite embedded in the pen. How cool is that? I personally really like the look of the Future Edition, which features an interchangeable tip so you can have a rollerball or a fountain tip and easily switch back and forth as desired. The new Interstellar gift set is particularly perfect. It comes beautifully packaged and includes a notebook and a bunch of other excellent accessories. These are not only high-end pens that write really well, they're also an endlessly satisfying addition to any desk. I mean, I'm constantly fidgeting with mine while we're streaming or I'm working on something on the computer. Use code NSF to get a very special 20% off for the next 48 hours, plus free shipping on all hover pens to most countries. If you're watching this more than 48 hours after it went live, don't worry, you still get 10% off, plus free shipping. Use the link in the description so Novium knows we sent you. Thanks again to Novium for sponsoring this video and for making a cool product.
So, with Booster 14 back in Mega Bay 1 and Ship 33's engine test campaign potentially complete, all eyes are on two key things. The first is the calendar to see when Flight 7 might take place. Unfortunately, we don't have a crystal ball, and we haven't received any updated information on the schedule for that flight for almost a month now. But one thing is certain, with SpaceX aiming for up to 25 Starship launches next year, the company will need to produce and test vehicles at a much faster pace than it has been in the past. And that's the second thing people are keeping an eye on. Well, at least we are, it's rather important. Next up, after Booster 14 and Ship 33, are Booster 15 and Ship 34. Ship 34 finished stacking a few weeks ago and still sits inside Mega Bay 2. The next major step for this vehicle should be rolling to the Massey's outpost for cryogenic proof testing. This week, Mary caught teams working on the ship thrust simulator stand on 2 different days. This stand, located near the rocket garden in these clips, has pushers that simulate the thrust of all 6 engines on the aft of the ship to ensure it can endure those forces during flight. Every ship now goes through this process. It's installed on this stand before being sent to Massey's for cryogenic proof testing, all while undergoing that thrust simulation. Of course, this work could just be routine maintenance of hardware, but once again, a rapid launch cadence will mean a rapid test cadence, so we'll be keeping our eyes peeled in case SpaceX decides to roll Ship 34 out for cryo testing in the coming days or weeks. In the meantime, Booster 15 is still shying away inside Mega Bay 1, also awaiting its own round of cryogenic testing at Massey's. One potential sign of progress in its construction is the sighting this week of sections for a booster's aerodynamic chines being moved into Mega Bay 1. Booster 14 already has its chines, and Booster 16 isn't complete enough to receive them, although you never know. So there's a good chance these chine sections are for Booster 15, which means we might not be too far away from seeing it roll out for cryo testing as well. Since we've been asking about Flight 7 lately, let's change the tune a bit. What do you think the timeline for Flight 8 looks like? Do you think we'll get cryo testing done before the end of this year? How soon after Flight 7 do you reckon they might launch Flight 8? Let us know in the comments. In fact, why don't we start thinking about Flight 9? If no boosters are skipped or reused, that flight should see Ship 35 and Booster 16 flying together. As you can imagine, we've also seen progress on these 2 vehicles this week. As for Booster 16, we've observed the last 2 barrel sections for this vehicle being moved into Mega Bay 1 for stacking. If you recall from our recent Starbase update episodes, the liquid oxygen tank for this booster was completed a few weeks ago, and SpaceX has recently started building up the liquid methane tank for the vehicle. This other half of the booster consists of 4 barrel sections, with the forward dome of the booster sitting right at the top. We saw the dome last week along with the barrel beneath it, and it's the remaining 2 barrels that we saw this week. One interesting detail about how we know these barrels are meant for this particular tank is that the third one from the top has the stabilizer point for the chopsticks. The other barrel is the only 4-ring section of the top half of the booster, and it also houses the flight termination system charges. These sections have likely been mated together inside Mega Bay 1 by now, meaning there's only one major weld left to complete Booster 16. Once everything is ready, both halves will come together and a new booster will be born at Starbase. So that's the booster. What about Ship 35? Well, we We saw the beginning of stacking for this vehicle this week as well. With the new version of the ship, these vehicles are made up of 6 barrel sections and a nose cone. That's 1 extra barrel section compared to the previous version. Stacking of the ship always starts from the top, beginning by joining the nose cone to the payload bay section. Then, in order, underneath that goes the forward dome section, the common dome section, the top of the liquid oxygen tank, the middle of the liquid oxygen tank, and finally the after dome section and engine skirt. Except for the initial stacking, the rest of these worlds are done inside Mega Bay 2 and are somewhat difficult to spot as they're tucked away in one of the building's corners. For ships 33, 34 and now 35, both the nose cone and payload bay sections had to roll from the Star Factory and be stacked inside the high bay. The Star Factory should be large enough to accommodate the mating of these 2 sections, but it seems SpaceX might not yet have the required tooling for that, so for the time being, this process is taking place inside the high bay. Later in the video, we'll discuss some recent moves that may be related to SpaceX relocating this process into the Star Factory. But before we get to that, there are a few things to address. When Ship 35's payload bay section rolled into the high bay, we noticed it had missing tiles on the side, much like how SpaceX flew Ship 31 during Starship's 6th flight. This is significant because once SpaceX begins catching ships with Mechazilla, there shouldn't be any tiles on the sides of the vehicles, otherwise the arms would risk crushing the tiles as they slap against the vehicle. So seeing Ship 35 already missing tiles on the sides is a positive sign that these future vehicles are being built to be caught, even though we haven't actually seen any catching hardware installed on them. With both the payload bay and nose cone already stacked, the 2 sections were moved into the Star Factory for further outfitting. The next time we see them roll out will likely be for the installation of the Pez dispenser on Ship 35, which should occur inside Mega Bay 2. Barring any surprises, the vehicle won't leave the building until it's completely stacked. Inside the Star Factory, we've also seen progress on future ships, specifically their nose cones. It's a bit tricky to peek into the building, but the large windows on the road-facing side give us a glimpse of the nose cone production process. This process is done in steps, and Ship 38 is currently in the earliest of these stages. At the moment, we can see its liquid oxygen header tank in one of the workstations, and the nose cone itself is likely being manufactured nearby. Once completed, the nose cone will be stacked on top of this header tank and both will be welded together. Once that's done, the nose cone moves to the next workstation where Ship 37's nose cone currently is. Here, the nose cone receives its methane header tank and other support structures are welded on the inside. This is also the stage when the nose cone gets most of its composite overwrap pressure vessels, or COPVs. After all this outfitting is complete, the nose cone moves further down the line where Ship 36's nose cone is now being worked on. This appears to be the final workstation in the process, where the nose cone receives its heat shield, forward aerodynamic flaps, and their aero covers. In these shots, we can see that workers have started applying the white protective felt and black ablative layer on Ship 36's nose cone. In a few weeks, this nose cone will likely be finished with all these installations. At that point, it'll be at the same stage Ship 35's nose cone was at the beginning of the week, ready to be mated with its payload bay section. As we mentioned earlier, this step should be taking place inside of the Star Factory, but for some reason, the last 3 ships had this part of the process occurring inside the high bay. This could change soon. Maybe. Over the past week or so, we've seen some odd moves, such as single rings being moved out of the Star Factory and sent directly to the scrapyard at the Sanchez lot. We also observed a 4-ring barrel section being sent from the Star Factory to the Sanchez lot for scrapping. This particular barrel section appeared to be the result of adding a single ring to a 3-ring barrel section, as indicated by the different weld line on the topmost ring. While we don't have official confirmation, in the past, when we've seen similar pieces of hardware being scrapped, it's usually because they were used to qualify tooling and construction hardware. For instance, a few months ago, SpaceX qualified the welding turntable inside Mega Bay 2 by using multiple barrel sections that were later scrapped, which then allowed ship stacking to take place using that tooling. What's particularly interesting is that the barrel section that was scrapped seems to have been a single ring welded onto a 3-ring barrel section. If we look at the Block 2 payload bay section, this is also a 3-ring barrel section, and when it needs to be joined with the nose cone of the ship, that goes on top of it. So, connecting the dots, it wouldn't be surprising if that barrel section had been used to test the tooling that will eventually be used to weld the payload bay section and nose cone of ships inside the Star Factory. If that is the case, Ship 35 might just be the last ship to have any stacking done inside the high bay. In the last few weeks, we've observed crews dismantling all the internal scaffolding inside the high bay, and in fact, while we were peering in to check on Ship 35's nose cone stacking, we could see that the scaffolding had been completely removed. We've discussed this before, Gigabay, but it wouldn't be surprising if, in the future, the high bay was completely phased out and SpaceX instead constructed a larger bay. There have been hints of this recently, especially if you watched last week's Starbase update. The future of the production site could also look quite different from what we see today, and SpaceX is keen on making that change a reality by turning Starbase into its own municipality within Cameron County. This week, the company submitted a request to the county to incorporate Starbase as a Type C municipality. According to Texas's local government code, a community may incorporate as a Type C general law municipality if it, quote, constitutes an unincorporated city, town or village, contains 201 to 4,999 inhabitants, and meets the territorial requirements prescribed by Section 5.901. Cameron County Judge Eddie Trevino shared a letter regarding this request, stating that the petition is currently under review by the county. Once the review is complete, Texas law mandates that an election be called so registered voters in the area can decide on the incorporation. In other words, while there's still some work to be done before it officially becomes Starbase City, Texas, it's safe to say that there's a good chance it will go. Let's be honest, it's going to go through. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's bring it back to the present. And what's more present at Starbase than work continuing on the orbital launch mount? You knew that was coming. Once Booster 14 vacated the launch mount, scaffolding was seen once again on both the top deck and inside. Pad teams have returned to work on all of the components of the launch mount, from the booster quick disconnect to inspecting propellant lines and, of course, plenty of welding. Teams have also made multiple trips to the ship quick disconnect this week, likely preparing it for full stack operations in the coming weeks. The chopsticks have also been the focus of significant inspections and work. In one clip, for example, we can see an employee painting the chopsticks, or at least applying some sort of material to the arm. In another clip, some welding is being carried out at the end of one of the arms. All of this work, of course, needs to be thoroughly tested, and this week we saw SpaceX testing the arm multiple times. And I mean, a lot of times. But perhaps one of the major pieces of work at the launch site this week occurred at the tank farm. 6 tanks were installed, so let's go through them in order. The first one arrived very early on Monday morning, a long horizontal tank, which was transported to the tank farm area where the liquid nitrogen and liquid oxygen tanks are currently located. The following day, 2 more horizontal tanks were moved to the launch site. One of these was very similar to the first tank I mentioned, and it had a cautionary label indicating it contained nitrogen. We've seen these in the past, however, this label doesn't necessarily mean it'll be used as a nitrogen tank. It might simply be because it was used as one previously. This tank was placed in the same area as the longer tank brought in on Monday morning, so it could very well be used for liquid oxygen storage. The other tank was stubbier but wider, and it was placed in the area where the old vertical tanks used to be located. A 4th horizontal tank, identical in size to this one, was then transported to the launch site early on Thursday and placed next to the other stubby tank. The purpose of these tanks isn't entirely clear, but it's possible they'll be used to augment the liquid methane storage at the tank farm. If that's the case, we'll likely see a containment wall built around them, along with safety measures similar to those around the rest of the methane tanks at Starbase. To round off the tank parade, another pair of vertical tanks arrived later in the week and were installed closer to Pad B. These appear to be for liquid nitrogen. Their location suggests they might be associated with a potential deluge farm for Pad B. The nitrogen could be used to pressurize the system, much like how the deluge tank farm for Pad A uses water. Rather than having to build a giant water tower to push the water out of the deluge system, nitrogen could be pressurized at high levels to achieve the same effect. At Pad B, we expect that SpaceX will use the deluge system to protect the launch mount deck and the flame diverter underneath. This week, Mary spotted what appears to be the first parts for the flame diverter. In the clip, we can see a long tube with openings which could very well be intended for the deluge water system we mentioned earlier. In the background, there also appears to be parts for the frame that will hold the diverter. It's still quite early in the process, so it's difficult to fully picture how the final system will look. However, we'll keep an eye on its progress as SpaceX continues to assemble it. At the launch site, Tower 2 continues to receive attention, and this week we've noticed teams installing a considerable amount of scaffolding near the top of the tower. We've seen a similar setup on Tower 1 when, during the summer, it received reinforcements in that area to prepare for the epic booster catch during Flight 5. Given that the chopsticks and carriage system for Tower 2 are already undergoing the same structural reinforcements that we saw on Tower 1 systems, it wouldn't be surprising if these reinforcements near the top are intended for the same purpose as those from the summer on the first tower. As you can see, there's certainly a lot of activity happening at Starbase, and in case you missed it, we also recently released a Space Coast flyover video, which features a lot of other Starship related work taking place in Florida. You should definitely give it a watch. It'll be fascinating to see how the final weeks of the year unfold for SpaceX in South Texas, but that's all for this week. Thanks to Novium for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can get 20% off a hover pen for the next 48 hours and 10% after that by clicking the link in the description. I've been Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.